Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, the founder and president of the Pixel Project, and I'm moderating the 8th YouTube session of the 6th International Women's Day edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Now, through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 17 award-winning best-selling women writers to raise awareness about violence against women, and to raise funds to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking, and also to help us reveal the first mystery celebrity male role model portrait in our Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign. So we'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later, and you can find out more about the Pixel Project and how to end violence against women by visiting www.thepixelproject.net. So we have a really fabulous guest for today's live Read for Pixels discussion and Q&A session. We have the fabulous Maria Lewis. Now, Maria is an author, journalist, and screenwriter based in Sydney, Australia. Did I get that right, Maria?
Yeah, that's all. And let's just say Australia broadly, but hi, it's nice to meet you, whoever's watching.
And Maria's best-selling debut novel, Who's Afraid, was published in 2016, followed by its sequel, Who's Afraid 2, in 2017, which was nominated for the Best Horror Novel at the Aurealis Awards in 2018. And Who's Afraid is being developed for television by the Emmy and BAFTA award-winning Hoodland Entertainment. That's really exciting. And her fourth book, The Witch Who Courted Death, was released on Halloween 2018 and won the Best Fantasy Novel at the Aurealis Awards in 2019. And her latest novel, set within the shared supernatural universe, The Wailing Woman, was released in November 2019, and that's unusual because it stars a banshee. Banshees are not usually the protagonist in any, UF novel, any fantasy novel. So
yeah, it is highly unusual. There's not very much banshee pop culture out there, which is one of the reasons that I was really attracted to it, because all my other novels focus on different types of supernatural monsters and everything's through the female lens, and we hadn't done banshees yet, and banshees are exclusively female in all the folklore and myths, so I wanted to give it a crack. If I succeeded, I don't know, that's up to the readers.
And let's talk about your goodies. So you have also generously donated some super exclusive treats to the stash of author goodies that you have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. You have one 30-minute Skype call, and you're happy to chat about books, writing, pop culture, feminism, and anything.
I'll read your tarot. No, whoever signs up for this goodie, we can chat about whatever you like. Maybe you want publishing advice, maybe you want self-publishing advice, maybe you're trying to get into screenwriting, or you want to write more about pop culture, or maybe you're in isolation and just want to chat to someone across the other side of the world. Those are all options. So basically the chat is totally up to you if that's the goodie that you decide to purchase to help the Read for Pixels campaign.
Yeah. Or you can donate to get this, 2 different opportunities to be immortalized in Maria's book. So there are 2 different Tuckerizations available. One is naming a minor character in Maria's 3rd Who's Afraid book, called Who's Still Afraid, and that's coming out in summer 2020. So that's going to be quick. If you want that, you got to be quick because Maria has to beat the printers in there. Or you can name a minor character in Maria's book that's coming out at the end of 2020, and this is for this particular Tuckerization, you can choose whether the character is a goodie or a baddie. Maria's goodies are available to donors anywhere in the world, but you better hurry up to donate to get it because they're only a limited number. There's one of the Skype call, there are only 2 Tuckerizations, and once they're gone, they're gone. That's it, no more.
No more Tuckerizations, which I didn't understand what Tuckerizations were. Like, I understand in principle what that is as a goodie, but I didn't know that it was called the Tuckerization. And I was very confused because I was like, I have to call the characters Tucker? Like, what's happening here? But now I understand. Now I'm fully versed.
Yeah. Oh, and the good news is we've raised $5,440 so far. So we shot past our original $5,000 goal. And we're now aiming to reach our $10,000 stretch goal to make up for last year's funding shortfall. So please give generously. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work, including our campaigns, programs, and initiatives like this one, like Read for Pixels. And they all go towards helping end violence against women. And if you just joined us and you're watching the session on YouTube right now, you'll also be able to ask Maria questions live. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so you can type in your questions into the chat box to the right of the screen. And Anusha Kandasivam, who is today's chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to Maria to answer. And now over to Maria. I think Maria is going to read from one of her books, and we are going to just issue a small content warning that there might be strong language there. So over to you, Maria.
Few little swears. This is a section from The Wailing Woman, which is my latest book. Given the Pixel Project and the Pixel Project and Read for Pixels was all about women and supporting women and trying to end this horrible, horrible violence against women and girls around the world, I wanted to read an excerpt from The Wailing Woman because it is a story about 6 sisters and the relationship that they have with each other and how they're working together to overcome a supernatural patriarchal structure, which I feel like we can all relate to. And the section that I'm about to read is from chapter 3. This is quite early in the book, and it's a little, well, you know what? I'm not gonna give you a preview. I'm about to read it, so I'm just gonna go ahead with that. This is in Sadie's perspective. Sadie is the main character and also a banshee. The footpath beneath her was hot in the summer sun, the day already beginning to heat up despite the fact it hadn't hit midday yet. She trailed behind her sisters in a line, Shannon at the front and all of the others at her back as they made their way down Coogee Hill. Most of those around them with towels draped over their shoulders and eskies in hand would continue down to the main beach, totally unaware of the slice of paradise tucked into the rocks nearby. Shannon took a sharp right turn, Sadie watching the other people with pity as they pressed on. The entrance to McKever's ladies' baths was discreet, looking like little more than a narrow trail that veered off the main one and towards a public bathroom. Yet as they each donated a gold coin into the bucket being held by a smiling volunteer, it was as if the world opened up when they turned the corner. Cerulean blue waters stretched out towards the horizon, far as the eye could see, with the occasional splash of white as foam broke along the surface. She could taste the salt on the air, watching as surf splashed against the rocks down below, the jagged brown edges jutting up towards the sky like outstretched hands. A particularly large wave broke on the rocks, frothy foam crossing an immense distance before landing in the waters of a pool that wasn't immediately visible from above. The further you strolled past the change rooms and 2 small lawn areas where women lay sprawled out on towels, the more you could see the spectacular rectangular shape full of water, so green and lush and tropical that it didn't look as if it could be real life. After the unexpected arrival of Texas Contos and his uncles the night before, it had been Shannon's idea for everyone to take the day off. Sadie knew what she was doing. Her older sister was trying to distract the family and divert any niggling worries they had about the return of Andreas Contos' son. The best way to do that was the ladies' baths. It was somewhere she only ever came with her sisters, all of them, if possible. Usually as soon as one Burke woman learned another was heading to the baths, they all wanted to go. They had been coming here since she was 12, it feeling like something sacred shared between not just the women in her family, but the women of her city. On warm days like today, every spare inch of space was covered with the female body. All shapes, all sizes, all ages. There was no judgment or uniform way a woman was supposed to look here. Because of that, almost every person Sadie passed on her way down to the rocks to their spot near the water's edge had their breasts exposed. A lady that crossed her path was in her 50s and completely naked, her skin dripping with seawater after a recent dip in the pool. Another squeezed past her, a green patterned hijab matching the material of a long-sleeved swimsuit perfectly. Sadie had called it Themyscira once, referring to the female island of Amazons in Wonder Woman, and her sisters had ribbed her for it ever since. As she threw her towel down on the rocks, Kiwi and Catriona seeking out positions in the shade under an outcrop, Sadie still thought of it that way as she glanced around and saw women, only women, everywhere she looked. Nora was rubbing SPF 50 plus sunscreen on her fiancé Topeka's back, all of the Burke sisters having applied theirs hours earlier to protect their fair, Irish skin from the sun's harmful rays. Shannon was unpacking an esky full of snacks, while Ina had the one full of booze. She passed out ice-cold ciders to all of them, Sadie clinking hers with her cousin Colleen in cheers and thinking not for the first time that she wished Saoirse was here. "Who's coming for a dip first?" Bridie asked, getting to her feet and untwisting the sarong at her waist to reveal a red and white polka dot swimsuit. She had a pair of cat-eye sunglasses on her face and a floppy, wide-brimmed hat to really complete her Lucille Ball at the beach aesthetic. "I am," Catriona answered, taking her cousin's hand for balance as she leaped across the rocks. Naturally, Kiva followed, and then Ina, Nora, and Topeka, so that it was just Shannon and her left minding their things. Everyone was doing a very good job of pretending things were fine. They were smiling, they were chipper. "This was a good idea," Sadie signed, before taking a sip of her drink and enjoying the warmth of the sun on her skin as she stripped off. "That's all I have," Shannon replied. "Great ideas and a mediocre set of tits." Sadie had been in the process of taking another sip when she snorted her drink, her chest moving with laughter as she wiped her lips. "I think you have a great rack," she told her, face solemn with respect as she signed the words. "Not like yours," Shannon replied, giving her an appreciative nod. "When you eventually lose your V-plates, those are going to make someone very happy." Sadie slapped her sister on the arm, mouthing at her to shut up as she looked around to see if anyone had overheard Shannon's declaration. "Oh, chill out," Shannon chuckled. "No one cares that you're a virgin except for you. Doesn't mean the whole east coast of Australia needs to know. Besides, my boobs come from the 10-kilogram difference between us, so I got dad's lankiness and flat chest," her sister shrugged, interrupting her. "You got mum's curves and boobs before 7 kids sucked them dry." Shannon looked down at her own chest, prodding what was there in a low-cut full piece. "Actually, my pregnancy boobs were pretty great, I'll give you that." Shannon and her fell into an easy silence, the chatter of bathers around them ambient background noise. Just because this was an orchestrated distraction didn't mean she couldn't enjoy it. And Sadie didn't want to be left alone with her thoughts, which were plagued with worries her sisters were pretending they didn't have. She had no opinion about Denton boys either way, good or bad, but over the years they had worked out how to navigate him. They knew how to get by with Denton as their liaison in the supernatural world. Texas taking over, well, Texas was an unknown entity and one that came loaded with a complicated personal history intertwined with her family. She didn't buy the line about Denton requesting a transfer, not for a moment, which meant he'd either fucked up or they wanted a sharper eye on the Burke sisters. Neither scenario was good. In her head, a supercut began playing of the Texas Contos she'd known. The stocky, young boy had grown into a stocky, young man. All the afternoons, all the mornings, all the play dates, all the times she'd pretended to be interested in dinosaurs just so he'd hang out with her rather than her sisters. Saoirse had teased her relentlessly when she learned about Sadie's epic crush, telling her boys were totally festy. Her older sister had turned out to be gay, so that hadn't been a lie on her part. An adult form, though, the grown Texas was anything but. She felt angry for a moment at what should have been. They should have spent the past decade as neighbors, that childhood crush developing into resentment and then all the way back around to teen romance based on their sheer proximity alone. Instead, The night she had lost her voice, she'd also lost one of her favorite people. When she'd finally learned about his father shipping him overseas, it had been weeks later. There was no way to contact each other or even write letters, regardless of the fact her family would have destroyed them the second they were discovered. It was just another possibility, another potential future that had swung shut on her like a door caught in a gust of wind. She didn't know the Texas contest who had returned, and yet at the house last night she had the strangest sense that he was watching her, understanding what she was saying as she signed to her sisters. Logically, she knew that didn't make sense. There were many different forms of sign language, and just because you knew one, American Sign Language, for instance, that didn't mean you knew another, like Auslan, Australia's sign language. Some symbols were universe, such as bullshit, her favorite. That's bullshit for those of you playing at home. But there were intricacies it took years to learn and constant study if you wanted to be fluent. AOF had everyone in the family take beginners classes and then moderate classes in Auslan after the incident which saw Sadie lose her voice. So that got all the Burkes up to at least conversational levels. There were specialist classes after that, usually filled with aspiring legal clerks or adults pursuing specific types of jobs. The Burke sisters were always an oddity in those, with Shannon and Nora old enough to slip under the radar, but the remaining siblings varying from late to early teens. They'd done it though, all of them, making sure Sadie would never be isolated in terms of communication. Saoirse had been the sister to lead the charge when it came to catch-up choices, ones that only lasted a few hours but took you through updated vocabulary and symbols. Nothing could beat constantly using them though, if it was the only way to increase your speed and confidence. If Texas could understand what she was saying, without the added assist of her mouthing the words as she signed them, that meant he had learned Auslan at some point and was competent. The question was, why? Yet another thing she didn't have the answer for, at least not yet. She wanted to get to the bottom of the Denton boys situation too, and she had a rough idea about how she could tackle that and the pressing case of Texas contest simultaneously. It meant sneaking out, because if her sisters knew her intentions, they would never let her try to do either thing, A, at all, and B, alone. But if there was a threat coming, the least she could do was anticipate it, give her family the heads up, so they could navigate it together. Sadie glanced down at her bikini, which was a shade of auburn that matched her hair perfectly. It had daisies patterned all over it, with white piping lining the bralette and high waist of the bottoms. If she was going to go where she needed to that evening, she'd have to ditch the florals or she'd be eaten alive, maybe literally. She felt the smallest surge of excitement charge through her veins, enjoying the prospect of being able to do something useful, even if it was slightly dangerous. She let that energy carry her down from the rocks. She carefully navigated to the route of the pool, gripping the chain that ran around the perimeter for support as she felt the cool and slippery surface beneath her. The women she loved were half submerged, laying on the rocks at the far end of the baths and looking more like selkies than the banshees they were. Goosebumps had sprung up on her skin as she made contact with the chilling turquoise water, and she watched the surface shimmer in front of her. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes and plunged. Ta-dam.
So taking a cue from what you just read,
Mm.
your Supernatural Sisters series features plenty of kick-ass and nuanced female characters, from Tommy Grayson, the werewolf, to Casper von Klitzling, who can see and handle ghosts. And she's really cool. I love Casper.
Actually, there's a drawing of Casper up here on my wall. I don't know if you can see it. It's just here. Casper, Barry, and Carla Tully, which was drawn for me by an amazing artist called Lauren Moran. So as you're talking about Casper, I'm literally making eye contact with her. Somebody also sent me this black and white portrait of her as well, which you can see just here. So
yeah,
all my fan art is on my wall at my desk. The things that people send me, it just goes straight up there.
She's so cool. And anyway, to get back to the question, so So all your female protagonists each have their own personal journey as they grapple with everything from their supernatural or paranormal powers to female friendship and sisterhood. Who and what and who are your inspiration for your female characters?
Well, I think the biggest inspiration, and I have to start at the very beginning because obviously without Tommy, none of the rest of the women would have gotten to exist. So if that first book, Who's Afraid, and Tommy Grayson's story specifically, if that had been a flop, then I wouldn't have gotten to tell all of these other types of stories. So it was something I had an idea for and I had pitched originally to my publishers, Little Brown, but the publishing industry is obviously very tricky, so they were cautious to wait and see how the first two books went, which are about Tommy Grayson, but that's also in those first two books where many of the central characters for the series first pop up. Casper, for instance, who's the main character of The Witch Who Courted Death, her first appearance is in Who's Afraid 2. Heath pops up in Who's Afraid 1 briefly, and then Who's Afraid 2, Lorcan. Those kind of characters that people have really fallen in love with, they all sort of make their first initial appearance in those books, which was great because it gave me a chance to establish the world and establish the universe that all of these other characters would go on to live within. For instance, It Came from the Deep is a book. I keep describing it as like reverse Little Mermaid, which makes people think that I mean fish head, people body, which is not the case at all. What I mean is it's about a woman who discovers a merman, and that couldn't be more different from many of the other types of books in the series. But once you establish the world, you give yourself that sort of infrastructure that you can expand and tell those stories. So I guess my inspiration had always been, hopefully, to have the opportunity to talk about lots of different types of women and use that vessel of stereotypical female monsters as like the Trojan horse that I could get in there and tell those kind of stories. Who's Afraid and Who's Afraid 2 are all about female rage. Basically, any story that has Tommy in it is about female rage and the feminine grotesque, because I think a lot of us can relate out there to going through life with a lot of anger and a lot of aggression and not feeling like we have the opportunity to properly express it as women. It Came from the Deep was all about discovery. The Witch Who Courted Death, I mean, Tommy Grayson is a biracial werewolf in her early 20s. Casper von Klitzing is a woman in her 30s. She's not on that journey of self-discovery in the same way as Tommy. She's a transradial amputee, and she is out on a quest for vengeance, if you will, but her journey is more of a love story, more of an unconventional love story, which is very different from Who's Afraid, which definitely has romantic elements to it. It Came from the Deep for sure has romantic elements to it. I like kissing books, in case you can't tell. So I like to put a lot of those kind of things in there, things that I enjoy, like romance, but also murder, but also a good mystery, but also really interesting world building and hopefully supernatural elements and a great main cast, but also very specific supporting characters, all that kind of thing. Where by the time I got to The Wailing Woman, I was trying to, again, tell the story of a different type of woman. The main character, Sadie, who you may realize from the chapter that I read for majority of the book, her and most of the other female characters communicate through sign language, but specifically they communicate through Auslan, Auslan is the sign language most commonly used in Australia by people who are either deaf or hearing impaired. So that was something that I hadn't seen done in a book before, and was a type of protagonist that I really wanted to represent, and hopefully represent as accurately as possible by speaking to people within that community and doing a lot of research. So to sum up the answer to your question, I'm sorry, I realized I went on a little bit of a rant. Basically, I wanted to tell the types of stories about the types of women that I felt that I hadn't seen out there through the vessel of supernatural world and supernatural characters, because sometimes it can be very exclusionary for women. There's a lot of male-centric fantasy stories out there. I think the publishing industry obviously is changing a lot. Women and female writers and female editors and female publishers have more power than ever before, but those are the kind of stories that I wanted to tell, ones that were fantastical in nature, but very grounded and realistic in origin.
Yeah, and you know, you're talking about male, you know, it being male-dominated fantasy, and you know, when I saw that your series is called Supernatural Sisters, that put
Yeah.
me in mind of the extremely popular Supernatural TV series.
Mm.
Uh, and you know, which is male dominated, has quite a few instances of toxic masculinity and has fridged its fair share of female characters, including Charlie, whose death was the last straw for quite a few of the show's curiously female dominated audience. Do you think of your series as a counterpoint or pushback to that series?
Oh, sorry. What was the series that you?
It's Supernatural. It's been running for 14 seasons.
Oh my god.
Basically,
Oh,
yeah,
Supernatural, the show
yeah,
Supernatural.
Sam and Dean, yeah.
Right. Sorry. I was like, all I heard was I must have missed the title of the show because I heard you say, you know, that Supernatural series. I was like, I haven't heard of a show called Supernatural series, but now I understand. Yes, I hear what you're saying. It is interesting, isn't it, that show has run for so many years, and it's essentially about two brothers, right, who navigate structures that are usually very female dominated. Like you think Vampire Diaries, Buffy, Charmed, Teen Wolf was very male centric, I guess, but majority of the shows within those genres are usually female dominated, but they haven't lasted as long as Supernatural has. I haven't watched that show, so I couldn't speak to the specific themes in it, but what I really wanted to highlight by having the series called the Supernatural Sisters series, which is a bit of a alliteration mouthful, I wanted to highlight how interconnected women are, regardless of where they're from, their ages, their backgrounds, their backstories, their histories, their futures, their genders, their sexualities, their religion. Women, and I think the tenets of feminism that I abide to and believe in are that we're all connected and can continue to be connected and achieve equality by working together. And so that was sort of the bigger theme that I was trying to highlight in the title of the book series, if that makes sense. I mean, if you've read all the books, it's very obvious the interconnectivity. Like that's one of the big, I guess it's like a big theme of the Wachowskis. Lily and Lana Wachowski, who did the Matrix series. They also did Jupiter Ascending, which people hate, but I actually secretly love. So, you know, Cloud Atlas, Speed Racer, stuff like that. That's a big theme of the sisters' work is interconnectivity. And regardless of like some of the big high concept themes of those films and the TV show Sense8, that's sort of the big underlying message of their work. And because I was taking a very female-centric approach, that's what I really wanted to highlight with that title specifically, but also with the events in the book. You know, that's one of my favorite things about it, is that I feel like you can pick up any book. You don't have to have read the book that came before or the book that came after, because the main characters shift per novel and the settings shift as well. So the idea was to hopefully not ostracize new readers, but at the same time, if you'd been reading from the beginning, there would be something special for you. That was the kind of the point. It's a very common comic book thing. I'm a massive comic book nerd, and Stan Lee had this saying that every comic book was somebody's first comic book. And so that's the idea that I was trying to do, is that you could enjoy a story on its own, but also if you'd read all the others, you could still get something from it. And in each of the books, you see different types of women working together, not always liking each other, because I don't feel like we have to always like each other to work together towards the same cause, you know. Just like shared goals and shared values can be important enough.
Mm-hmm. And that's on the topic of stereotypes and tropes. How do you specifically break stereotypes to create female characters like the ones you have? You know, they have agency and they deal with the world around them, including situations that involve sexism, misogyny, and violence against women. So, how do you do it? How do you break these stereotypes? You talk about using, you know, monsters as Trojan horses.
Yes. Well, I mean, I quite like it's a conversation I have with my writer friends quite a lot, and we quite like stereotypes and cliches in a way because they exist for a reason, and you can use them like use them for good, if that makes sense. Like you can use them for good or evil depending on your agenda. But for instance, the character of Tommy Grayson, that's a character that she's a female werewolf, and just straight up on the line, if you're just talking werewolves, there are not that many female examples in pop culture. And that was, for me, I felt a really big stereotype, that the werewolf story and the werewolf themes and tone and messaging was something that was exclusive to the male experience. Like that didn't seem accurate to me. And I thought if there was anyone who was going to understand living with a lot of anger and rage and aggression, and also blood, gore, and turning into a monster for a few days a month, that was going to be women more than men. But historically, majority of the werewolf stories we had seen were not only about men, but were about white men, usually middle-aged, who were like, oh, the curse. And I thought that there was a real opportunity there to examine the things that women go through, such as suppressing rage, and like what happens if you think you're the hero of the story, but the superpowers you end up getting are actually very antagonistic, and how do you reconcile that version of who you thought you were with the version of yourself that you are? And Tommy makes a lot of dumb decisions. She makes a lot of antagonistic choices. She's a very complicated, prickly, and unlikable character in a lot of ways. And I think it was really important to me as well to have a character that wasn't easily likable. I wanted her to start in one place and go on a journey somewhere else. I didn't want her to start as this fully formed woman who has everything together, because I feel like that's inaccurate to a lot of the female experience. I wanted her to view things as very black and white at the beginning of the novel, and as we progress through the other novels, obviously because there's more coming, her perspective changes to multitudes of grey. It's not a black and white world at all. It's a very complicated and complex universe that she's been exposed to. And that for me was one of the big sort of stereotypes, is that all werewolves have to be male, white, and middle-aged. And Tommy was one of the biggest examples of breaking down that barrier. But also her superpowers and her abilities as a werewolf are very physical. Like that's her strength, is it's like a physicality. She can decapitate somebody with her bare hands. What a dream. She can, trade a punch with a guy blow for blow. Whereas a character like Casper, she's somebody who her physical strength doesn't exist on the same plane as Tommy's. She's just as feared and revered in the supernatural world, but the things that make her scary, the things that make her notorious in this universe, is her mental strength, her loyalty, her compassion, her intelligence. So I didn't want to have female characters in this world that only have physical strength, or only that quote unquote strong female character where you're just giving them masculine traits. I feel like a character like Willow in Buffy, for instance, is someone who's a really great example of that, because she's the yin to Buffy's yang, and that Buffy has all this physical strength, but Willow's strength is not something that has any physicality attached to it, at least in those early seasons. Her strength is her intelligence, her cunning, her compassion, her loyalty, her love, her heart. Those things can be just as important, and just as important to show readers as a character that has like a very physical superpower, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It does, because a lot of authors get really irritated by the term strong women.
Yes.
Strong women, because what do you mean? Do you mean strong like physically strong, or it's
and you never hear about strong male characters as well. That's the thing. I'm like, you're never reading a interview or a feature article or review where somebody's calling the male character a strong male character. Like, it's just not a thing. They're just a male character. Yet if it's a female, it has to be, oh, she's a strong female character. And there's also such a hesitancy to have female villains as well. Like, that's something that I personally, like, as a writer, I'm trying to tackle and accomplish, because it's so much easier to always have it metaphorically be the patriarchy. But at some point, I feel like true equality is not just having female main characters, but having female supporting characters, having female protagonists and antagonists. Like, we need to have the full spectrum of the female experience rather than just one or the other.
Yeah, and speaking of that, your books could be, some people would say they're urban fantasy, because your protagonists are, werewolves, witches, banshees, and a lot of the action takes place in cities. And the idea of urban fantasy characters with personal issues and, in some cases, a sizable dose of angst is not a new one. However, going back to your remark on villains, female villains, readers may perceive them as unlikable instead of modeling them as complex characters as they would do if they were male. So, do you ever feel pressured by gender and cultural stereotypes to make them likable or relatable?
100% all the time, yes. I think Tommy in particular is a hard sell because she's a very unlikable character, and it's sort of interesting that I started the series with the most difficult character. Like, she's the hardest sell, but at the same time, that was the character that people first met, and it's all first person. So even though I think if Who's Afraid and Who's Afraid 2 had been written in third person, which I always kind of wish that I did, to be honest, just because I could show more perspectives, especially within the Ehe pack and other characters within the world in different locations that you're not so much restricted to with first person. But with Tommy in particular, like, because that book was in first person, it made her, like, you had that direct channel into her brain and into her head. So even though she's quite antagonistic from the outside, you had that vessel to communicate with her inner thoughts and understand her intentions. With It Came from the Deep, Which You Call to Death, and The Wailing Woman, my 3 books that came after Who's Afraid and Who's Afraid 2, they're all written in third person, and The Wailing Woman in particular is written in third person from a male's character's perspective and then a female character's perspective, because I wanted to have that dual point of view and offer readers something that they hadn't necessarily seen before, and to offer perhaps a little bit more of a balanced perspective. And so that's what I had been aiming to try and do. So it's constantly something that I'm working through and working with. I'm seeing a lot of fiction out there at the moment that's sort of pushing those boundaries, especially in the romance world. Like, my books are classified as urban fantasy, but to be honest, outside of the publishing industry, that's not really a term that a lot of people are familiar with. It's either just paranormal or fantasy or horror. My books come up in horror and fantasy categories a lot. Science fiction, depending on the book, paranormal romance. But in the world of romance, there's been a lot of interesting challenging of gender archetypes and predetermined roles and relationships within them that has been really fascinating to watch. I read a lot of romance and have started reading a lot of romance more in the past sort of year or 2 years, in a bid to try and make my love scenes better. And now I'm really hooked. And a really good friend of mine, Jodie McAllister, who's an author as well, she's author of the Valentine series, which is about smart girls who murder fairies. And she's a doctor in romance. She has a PhD in representations of female virginity loss. And her discussions about how the industry is changing, how genre borders are shifting as well. I think that's something that's really important, because my books and books like mine combine a lot of options. I think it's really interesting because there's a lot of blurring between the traditional conventions of what is a horror book, what is a fantasy book, and then the subgenres within that, monster novels, creature novels, all that kind of stuff.
I think you've just answered a question.
Your next 82 question.
Yeah, that someone actually asked, Misty306. Hi, Misty. Thanks for joining us today. She said, is there a difference between paranormal and urban fantasy? I know it sounds weird, but I really want to know if there's an answer.
That's a great question, Misty306. I'm so glad you asked it. I'm starting to lose my mind. Is there a difference between paranormal and urban fantasy? I personally, and this is just my opinion, I say no. But where the terms come from, urban fantasy as a term, essentially what that means is urban, the real world, and fantasy, fantastical elements. So something like Harry Potter could be classified as urban fantasy because there's a fantastical world happening within the confines and constraints of the real world. Platform 9 3/4 is the perfect example of that. True Blood is a really good example of urban fantasy. But those technically all count as paranormal as well. The wider term that you're seeing used a lot more these days is speculative fiction. And speculative fiction is becoming more popular because it encompasses science fiction, it encompasses paranormal, urban fantasy, paranormal romance. I personally don't think there's really a difference. Paranormal tends to be associated more with things that have romantic elements to it, like the work of Carrie Arthur and Ella Hamilton, like Laurel K. Hamilton. Sorry, I was like L.L. Hamilton. That's not right. Laurel K. Hamilton. That tends to be considered paranormal and paranormal romance, but those books are just as much urban fantasy. Urban fantasy, as I mentioned, it's a very industry-specific term, and they're phasing it out at the moment, so you don't hear it used as much as it used to be. They'll tend to say speculative fiction or spec fic. There's actually a really good graph online. If you Google, this is specific, but if you Google what is speculative fiction and then hit images, it will come up with, I think it's the third or fourth image along, because I just did a presentation for some high school students on what is speculative fiction. I was like, this is a great graph. And so I put it in my PowerPoint presentation. But it's multicolored sort of Venn diagram type structure, and it shows you how the different genres fit into the bigger speculative fiction bubble. So I hope that answers your question, but it's like very nuanced, really.
So there's a remark from Anusha. You were talking about female villains, and I love a good female villain. Someone really evil and intelligent. So I think Cersei in Game of Thrones qualifies, I think.
Oh my God. So much. And Ursula is one of my favorite female villains. Like, come on, what's not to love? She's based on a drag queen. She's based on the character of Divine, who was really good friends with the writers of The Little Mermaid and a bunch of the artists on that film. But also she's someone who clearly has a contract, states what the terms of that contract are, and then a teenager tries to break the contract. Like, who's the real villain here? I don't know. Ursula's great. And she has the best songs and the best lipstick, and just love Ursula. She's wonderful. There's a lot of actually really fun sort of Disney villains that I love. Cersei is a really fun villain as well, because she's just entirely like meticulous, and like everything, her motivation is her children. That's like kind of her sole motivation throughout the series. And so the things that she'll do for those kids is literally anything. Faith is another character that I love, who's classified, I guess, as a villain, although she flips back and forwards. And I like characters that dance on that line. That's really interesting to me.
Yeah. So Anusha says, "Oh yes, love Ursula. She rocks."
I can't wait to. I don't know if anybody saw this, but they did they do live versions of musicals. It's become like a much more popular thing. They did a version of Grease with Vanessa Hudgens and Julianne Hough, but they did a live Little Mermaid, and it was so good. It had Queen Latifah as Ursula, and it was just unbelievable. Like, Melissa McCarthy is supposed to be playing Ursula in the Disney live action movie, and I'm just like, how are you even going to come close to Queen Latifah? She's incredible.
Oh, so going back to, you were talking about romance just now and reading romance. I have a confession. I've been reading romances since I was a teenager.
Love it.
Sneaking them in, but actually it's pretty good. And we're actually hosting Maya Rodell, who's one of the most feminist of historical romance authors, this Sunday. So it's Monday in Aussie time, so Oz time. So if it's at 11:30 a.m. Melbourne time, if you have time to tune in.
I will be. I'm working from home for the interim, so I've got 2 laptops. I can have one streaming that and the other watching.
Okay, so speaking of romance, so the line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in fantasy books, whether it's epic fantasy, urban fantasy, paranormal romance. Do you think this is an issue that writers in the genre have started tackling successfully in recent years?
Yes, definitely. And it's very interesting you bring that up. My friend who I mentioned earlier, Jodie McAllister, who writes the Valentine series, when I did The Wailing Woman, that was the first time I had a virginity loss scene in one of my novels. All of my previous books, the characters have been DTF, and older as well, you know, characters that were in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, their 50s. Virginity was not a central like plot element at all. And in The Wailing Woman, the character of Sadie Burke is 19, and she's in a very different place to pretty much all of my other female heroines. And so I knew I was going to have a virginity loss scene, but I was very nervous about writing it because I know there are so many do's and don'ts, and consent and coercion are something that can come up unintentionally but really insidiously in a lot of texts, and it doesn't age well. So I had I'm one of those people, because I come from a journalism background. I'm very I don't want to say obsessed, but I'm very like, I lean on primary sources rather than secondary sources. If I don't know something, my first instinct is to always find somebody who knows something, and then find somebody who knows what I don't, and basically ask them, get them to explain it to me. That's basically my whole thing. And so I had done that with, like, you know, with Banshee history, I was looking up things through the Irish Folklore Commission. Auslan, I was talking to Auslan teachers, people who'd made an Auslan documentary that I had worked on briefly, speaking to people who use American Sign Language, even though that's a different type of sign language. I wanted to talk about some of the bigger themes of communication and representation, things that they hadn't seen and that they would like to see, things that they see too often, that kind of thing. And virginity was one of those, a virginity loss scene was one of those things that I researched really carefully, because I didn't want to do any of those things as cliches or tropes that ended up becoming really harmful. And I was also conscious of the fact that with The Wailing Woman, more so than any of my previous books, it's likely that I would have a slightly younger audience. Most of my audience skews sort of, I want to say, like 16 to 60. So that's like a big branch. But The Wailing Woman, I was conscious of the fact there would be quite a few younger readers. And I just seen and read so many sort of like terrible virginity loss scenes where it was, oh, it just happened. And, you know, there are things like protection and contraception and all those like little meticulous things that you can weave in there into like a tapestry that make the scene, not only it can still be sexy and move the story forward, but at the same time they're really important to have there. And in my chats with Jodie, who like I said is an expert on virginity loss in pop culture, that those were some of the big things that kept coming up, is this what it just happened idea, making sure that it was really forethought, that there had been a conversation, there was consent, was clear, there was no coercion. It was something that both characters were motivated to do, were clear on the ramifications, and were clear on what it was they were partaking in. And that was something that was really interesting for me as an author to write, because I don't know if those sort of, I mean, I'm sure they were always really well thought about by a lot of female writers, but it's just something that I was really nervous about doing. And I spent so much time trying to make sure that the one virginity loss scene that I have in my books wasn't A, terrible, but B, even subconsciously harmful in any way, shape, or form.
Oh, this is cool. So Misty, going back to the villains thing, Misty said V.E. Schwab wrote a great villain in Vengeful.
Yes, we love V.E. Schwab. She's so nice. I haven't met her personally, but she was on a pop culture convention tour that I tend to pop up on quite a lot in Australia called Supernova. And she was on the tour just before the last one that I'd done. And everybody said that she was so nice and seems to have really cool readers. Like they're all like chicks with really cool tats and like cool hair. I don't know what that says about her books and her work, but it's a really cool thing. It's like a cool side effect.
She's actually a Read for Pixels author. So we had her on before. Yeah, and her cat, her cat tried to walk across the keyboard. She was great. She's really.
I love that. I don't have a cat, but I do have flatmates. So if flatmates try to walk across the desk, I'll let you know. I mean, you'll see it, but you know.
Okay, so let's talk about men.
Yeah.
So there are, in your characters, your books have a whole range of male characters. You have misogynistic characters, you have characters who are respectful of women, their thoughts and their decisions, and some of the male-female relationships that you portray are generally quite equitable. So let's talk about the portrayal of men. So do you think reframing how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes, to bring, if authors brought us male characters who are more complex and vulnerable. Well, vulnerable would be the word that I would use. Away from hostile and toxic stereotypes. So away from the alpha male stereotype.
Yes.
Do you think that by doing that, you could break away from the toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons in The Wailing Woman, that book, as I mentioned earlier, it's told from dual perspectives. It's a chapter in Sadie's perspective and then a chapter in Texas Contos' perspective. He's the male lead, she's the female lead. And one of the reasons I did that was because in that book in particular, all of the antagonists are men, and they're part of a patriarchal, loosely, thinly veiled patriarchal structure, and the women are the matriarchy. Metaphors, I'm not very subtle about them, but because most of the villains in that book were males, I wanted to have a character who was inherently good. It's not to say he always makes good decisions or good calls, but somebody who deep down at his core is a good person who believes in women and is an ally to women and believes in doing what's right, even though the path to get there isn't easily identifiable. And somebody who's really he can confront his emotions, somebody who's very emotionally mature, somebody who's not toxic or an alpha male in any way, shape, or form, someone who is very emotionally intelligent. And I wanted to have that character there to offset the negative ones, but I also wanted it to be there because he's quite different from some of the other characters that pop up in the other books. I mean, The Witch Who Courted Death, that's a love story between two women, so male characters don't feature heavily in that book. Casper's brother is a ghost and he is a homosexual man, so he pops up in that book a lot, but we're not dealing with what are usually perceived as stereotypically straight heterosexual male stereotypes that create the alpha male sort of prototype model. Heath is a character that had popped up in a lot of the books and is somebody that sort of is an agent for chaos and it's a little bit different from that. But in Who's Afraid and Who's Afraid 2, the romantic lead, this character Lorcan, is designed to sort of be a proto-urban fantasy male character. He's somebody who is A, super hot, because they've all got to be super hot, and B, is mysterious, and C, has a lot of information. And essentially, by the time we get to the end of Who's Afraid and the end of Who's Afraid 2, or like the duration of Who's Afraid 2, the relationship between himself and Tommy, who's the main character, is disintegrating because there's an imbalance of power there. And that's kind of one of the things that I wanted to use him to point out specifically, is that in a lot of urban fantasy, the male romantic lead is somebody who has so much more power over the female protagonist if it is a straight cis heterosexual like dynamic in those main characters, which isn't always the case, but 9 times out of 10 in a lot of the well-known titles, things like Twilight and True Blood, that tends to be the relationship dynamic. A lot of those characters know more than the female character, and they know more about the structures of the world, their powers, their abilities, and they hold that information over that person's head. And that in and of itself is a really unhealthy dynamic and a real abuse of not just power, but information. They're using the knowledge that somebody doesn't have as a way to control them, which is really insidious and something that it's gaslighting basically. And it's something that I think a lot of women can relate to in their everyday life. And I think that's the best fantasy has things like dragons and zombies and, whatever, banshees, witches, werewolves, but it also is grounded. It grounds those fantastical elements and things that we recognize every day. And gaslighting is something that I think a lot of us can recognize every day.
Yeah. And, speaking of the real world, stories are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about cultural change. I mean, it is the first way that humans pass traditions on to each other through oral history. Before we all learned how to make marks on stones and paper and all that. And it's the same way now because, we're still teaching. Teaching is a very verbal profession. We pass knowledge through and all. And stories are a way of helping people make sense of concept themes. And so it's one of the reasons why we have Read for because we think stories are instrumental, pop culture is instrumental in changing, in sort of molding and reflecting what the public thinks about issues like sexism, the patriarchy, misogyny, violence against women. And, going down, this boils down to the fact that authors are so important because they're storytellers. So, in your opinion, how can authors strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about issues like violence against women while telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
I like being preachy. I think most people who know me would probably describe me as pedantic and preachy. So I don't know if I'm necessarily doing it in a subtle way. I think this is a byproduct of, at least for me, and I want to say I'm looking at the books that you can't see on screen because they're all just out of view, but I'm looking at the books on my shelf and the authors that I loved and love. And I feel like a byproduct of sharing stories, whether they're fiction or nonfiction or however you craft your stories, I feel like a byproduct of sharing your stories is the things that you believe in and the things that you're passionate about bleed into those stories as well. And it can shift depending on the types of characters that are telling the stories for you or the manner in which you're trying to tell that story. But I think you see it. I think you see the things like things that Gail Simone and Nicholas Scott and Kelly Sue DeConnick and Mariko Tamaki and some of those incredible generation of female comic book writers that we're living through at the moment, the things that they care about and the things that they're passionate about are present in their work and they bleed through, and it never comes at the sacrifice of the story. I think those two things can go hand in hand. I think you look at something like The Handmaid's Tale, for instance, and on the surface, maybe critics of that would describe it as pedantic or preachy, but the world building's still incredible, and the message could not be clearer. I mean, I think there's a lot of strengths to being pedantic and preachy, but making sure, I guess, not force feeding people is less to do with your personal beliefs and more with like how good of a storyteller you are, how you can slip those elements through in the way that you construct the world and the way you construct how those characters interact within a fictional made up universe, and even a fictional one too. Like one of my favorite writers is this guy called Shia Serrano. He has this book called Movies and Other Things, Basketball and Other Things, and also the Rap Year book. And he's a Mexican-American writer, and all of his work is nonfiction. But the things that he cares about, like representation and inclusion and diversity, they appear and feature prominently within his work. And he's talking about other people's art. Like his job is to discuss and dissect other people's pop culture, yet the values and things that are important to him pop up and bleed through in those texts as well. And I think that's testament to being a good writer. Even critics like Pauline Kael and things like that and Roger Ebert, you know the things that they care about and you know the things that they're passionate about, not because they're explicitly telling you, but maybe more because they're implicitly showing you through the work that they're doing.
And epic fantasy writer Ken Liu once pointed out, and short story writer as well, he pointed out that, a lot of geek boys shouting about, I don't want any politics in my fiction. But he said, well, too late. Everything's in there.
Yeah.
Every story has politics.
It's so funny that because there has been a lot of talk about the new Watchmen series, which is amazing. Highly recommend checking it out. But people saying it's too political or that they're like forcing stuff down your throat and not like the original Watchmen. And I was like, what? The original Watchmen is one of the most political texts ever. It is one of the most socially conscious pieces of speculative fiction ever. It's crazy. Superman was made as a character by two Jewish men growing up in America during World War II who were commentating and viewing very specific things happening in the universe. I mean, all of those characters and every character is grounded by the experience of their authors and the things that they were trying to get across to readers. So I don't think you can necessarily remove those things. They kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, and speaking of author's experience, your stories definitely passed the Bechdel test. They're depicting
I
like
don't know what the reverse Bechdel test is, but there might, in The Witcher Court of Death, I don't know if two male characters talk to each other about something that's not a woman, to be honest.
yeah, but the funny thing is, we women, we talk about a whole bunch of things, right? We don't always talk about men. I mean, we talk about the coronavirus pandemic. We talk about we talk about what we're gonna do with the kids now that there's no school in so many parts of the world. For example,
Way to bring it down, Regina. Way to bring the tone down.
And but so many speculative fiction authors have trouble writing stories that pass even such a simple test. Two women talking to each other about something other than a man. So, what can you suggest for writers who want to write female conversations and relationships realistically?
Know some women. Seems so stupid, but like honestly, it's like, do you have female friends and women in your life? And I think if you do, that really informs the way that you write female characters. The types of characters that you write are informed by the people you meet in everyday life. And sometimes like characters that are written in the later books, they have been informed by characters that haven't existed in the earlier books. Like I talked about how Tommy is a very physically strong character. So I wanted to write a character that wasn't physically strong in that same way, but was equally strong in 1,000 different other ways. So I think that is if you're trying to write, how do you write female characters in a way that's authentic and realistic? Know some women, chat to some women, hang out with some women. We're great. Highly recommend us.
Yeah, we basically, I had a friend who was appalled when this male writer who said, could you beta read my book? And she said there was not a single woman in that book. And when she asked him, he said, I don't know how to write women. So it's kind of mind-boggling, given that we are 50% of any population.
Truly, and it's also one of those things that I see a lot because I work in film and television as well, and so I see it a lot coming up as a discussion. There is this whole idea of like, how do we have these female characters that are relatable to people and authentic and like modern, and it's not a hurtful portrayal and all this kind of stuff, and struggling with like, oh, it's a female-led movie, or it's a female-led this, or it's a female superhero that, yada yada yada. But it's like for almost 85 years of the moving images history, women have, and people of color especially, have had to find a way to relate to straight male characters who are usually the protagonists in majority of the stories. And they've still been able to watch those movies and love those movies and relate to those movies and those characters and those worlds without having to see a version of themselves represented. And I think the opposite is true as well. I think like, I know my readership, right? And I would say 45% of my readership at least is men. And that's not surprising to me. It was a little surprising to my publishers, but I was like, why? That makes perfect sense. Men want to read strong, interesting, prickly, complicated women as much as women do. And women enjoy reading those types of male characters as well. So it's kind of a weird thing. Like we're catching up. The industry is catching up to what audience demand is, and it is also a big a key part of it, I guess, is having rooms and having boardrooms and decision-making rooms that are more reflective of the everyday experience, where we have not just women in those rooms, but we have people of color and we have people from different age groups and races and backgrounds and ethnicities green lighting those projects, because it's one thing to have those ideas and to write those characters, but it's another thing altogether to see them get the stamp of approval and see them get made, basically.
Yeah, and it's what is also astonishing is when you talk about the movie industry, is that women drive a lot of movies. Some of the biggest hits out there have a majority female audience, like chick flicks or whatever they want to label it, and yet they're going like, a woman could never be a lead in a superhero movie. No,
exactly. No. And then when you do have a all-female superhero movie, the first come out like Birds of Prey, and its box office is reported as a disappointment or a flop. But then something like Ford vs. Ferrari, which had a higher budget and did less money at the box office, is considered a win for dad cinema. So it's not just like the way these films get made, but it's the conversations that happen around those films, like Birds of Prey being reported as a flop, whereas something like Ford Ferrari is reported as a success, even though they almost have exactly the same margin of budget and profit, is really indicative of not just like the industry and the making of the industry being very male dominated, but the discussions being very male dominated as well.
Oh, I love Birds of Prey. Harley and her breakfast sandwich
Yeah.
and the hair tie. The hair tie.
Hair tie. Oh my God, I
Yeah.
have a Huntress tattoo. Huntress is my favorite character. So I was very excited to see a version of Huntress, and a version, I think, they never explicitly state, but I think it's quite clear that their version of the Huntress is someone who's on the spectrum, which I think is really like smart. And the way she interacts and the way they have her interact with the rest of the Birds of Prey, I was really surprised and delighted by. It was very different.
Yeah. So there's one more question for the audience, and then we can move to talking about geek culture. Oh dear.
Just a smiley face.
It's because it was moving quite quickly. So she says, where do you see speculative fiction moving towards now that the genre is gaining more recognition and admiration by the out group? Not sure what out group means.
I mean, I think, well, I'm not, Misty, I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like what they're saying is like by industries outside of speculative fiction, if that makes sense. Where do I see it moving? Interesting. I feel like we're at a real apex mountain now. Like if you're into speculative fiction film, or television especially, there's so many shows on different streaming services and different on-demand services that you can access now that are speculative fiction. There's in fact so many. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting time. And I wonder if that's going to start sprinkling down into fiction as well, because speculative fiction has always been around, but there's been a wee bit of a dip recently. And I wonder if that's going to go back up again, because as the situation in the world gets worse and worse, people like to have a distraction. They like to distract themselves from what's happening. They like to have a little bit of an escape. And that is what speculative fiction is, you know. Game of Thrones is more sword and sorcery, but it falls under the brief of speculative fiction, and we all know how popular that was for like the past 9 years. So like, what's the new thing that's stepping into its place? There's so many shows out there now that all fall into that category. So it's going to be very interesting to watch. I think. One second, I could feel a sneeze. I was like, I think one of the things that is going to be intriguing is how many more of these shows and books and things are we going to get? Are we going to see an increase? And like, is that sustainable? Do we hit an apex and then go down from there? Or are we at that point, that sweet spot of like 1998, where you had things like Alias and Buffy and Charmed and Dark Angel and Xena and Hercules and the X-Files, you know, like where you had an abundance of really cool stuff. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for. I don't think it's ever going to go away, and it hasn't ever since it's existed, from, you know, Mary Shelley first proving that anything men can do, teenage girls can do better and first with Frankenstein. So yeah, I'm excited to see where things go from here. More funding would be great for genre projects. I know I'm in Australia, and I assume most of the people watching this are not in Australia, but we have a real problem in this country. Well, we have so many problems in this country, but we have a real problem with our screen bodies not supporting and not funding genre projects like they do non-genre projects. So speculative fiction broadly in Australia is a real tough battle to get the government and the funding bodies to support it, even though we see the profit margins on speculative fiction being incredibly high compared to a fifth heroine drama in the Outback, that kind of thing. So I would like to see more infrastructural support for speculative fiction personally, but that's mainly in Australia, not necessarily the whole world.
All right. Misty, clarify outgroup refers to those who are not parts of the group most of the time.
Yeah,
I think culture versus popularity, which actually brings us to our second to last question, which is geek culture in general including speculative fiction, has had its share of critics saying that it is still too male-dominated, despite a rising number of prominent, well-respected, and well-known female authors and creators. So plus, there's still plenty of hostile, misogynist, and sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks. Think of the way they sunk the all-female Ghostbusters. What do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's books or comics or gaming or movies, more welcoming for women and girls?
That's a really good question, and I don't know if there's an easy answer because it's the bad behavior of a few, and I really want to emphasize a few, like the people who attacked Kelly Marie Tran for the Star Wars film, the people who sent me death and rape threats for writing about the Joker since September, so that's nearly going on 4 or 5 months now. The people who coordinate and organize Gamergate and things like that, they are the minority. They are not the majority, but they are a very vocal minority, and it can feel extremely isolating and extremely hostile. And that's the experience that you're dealing with when you're trying to engage with geek culture, especially if you're a woman or a woman of color or a queer woman in the geek culture world. And there's you're getting doxxed and trolled. Like, it's a really hard thing. I don't know what the answer is to that in terms of, like, a lot of this stuff all centers and begins from Twitter. Like, that's where a lot of you can usually tell something's starting to dip in a really negative way quickly through Twitter when you see really nasty hashtags start to get created and you're starting to get X amount of threats and hostile messages through Twitter. And I think one of the big reasons for that is Twitter doesn't have very good structures in place for protecting women and protecting people of color. They're very selective about who they do block and whose accounts they do take down, even though threats and harassment and homophobia and racism and misogyny can be very clear from those accounts. So that's why you see a lot of female creators and female creatives get off Twitter. I've thought about it so many times myself, and I would still like to do that. Like, it's just that there's so many good parts of social media, but there's just so many bad parts of it as well. So I'm not quite sure how we make it more welcoming. It's all you can do is try and make it more welcoming in your circle and part of the little corner of geek culture that you interact with. The rest of it, I feel like, in a way, is not my problem and not the problem of the people who keep getting harassed. It's up to the people who are more representative of the harassers to figure their shit out and start realizing that geek culture is for everybody and always has been for everybody. That's the weird thing. It's just that now, for once, there's maybe more types of a particular story than there used to be, and the men feel like that takes away. It's that whole thing of, like, if somebody has more equal rights, therefore I have less equal rights, but that's not actually true. It's a very men's rights activist mentality, but that's, I think, where I see a lot of the toxicity coming from within geek culture. It's a minority, but it can, I'm not denying it's extremely hard to deal with because I find it extremely hard to deal with as well.
Yeah, and, we had Stephen Graham Jones, the award-winning horror writer, and basically we were talking about this, and we all came. He's Blackfeet. He's Native American, and we basically came to the conclusion, all of us, that pop culture and geek culture is not pie. You can't cut it up and someone has a smaller piece than the other. It's not finite. It's not pie. Everyone gets a bit of it.
I love that saying. It's not pie. I love pie. And I want everybody to have some. But yeah, that's a great analogy. It's not pie. I'm going to write that on a post-it note and stick it on my wall, I think.
Yeah, it's not pie. Everyone can have how much of it they want. It's not going to run out. Misty, who also writes, she said about these harassers, the strange thing is they wouldn't say those things to your face. I learned very early on that I had to be as ruthless as them, but only when I have to be.
Yeah, that's actually, it's interesting. I had one interaction with a guy at a pop culture event that I was doing. I was the only woman on a panel with 3 other men, and it was towards the end of the panel that he asked this question, and it was why, and it was directed at me, obviously, being the only woman on the panel, an experience I'm weirdly used to. It was, why do women write fantasy, and why do you think that women should be allowed to write fantasy? And I was like, ugh, like, I'm not answering this question. I was so hostile and just such a crappy question anyway. I was like, I'm not answering this shit. So I kind of just like sat back and like sort of folded my arms because I wasn't going to address the question. And all the men on the panel like quickly jumped in and had really good responses and were really great allies. And then after the panel, I went back, and we have like an author signing booth section where you go and you sign copies of your book. And the guy came up to me from the panel, and there was a table between us. It wasn't super aggressive or anything, but it was extremely hostile. And he was like, I just want you to tell me why it is that you think you can write fantasy and why women can write fantasy, because I don't think they're very good at it and I'm sick of reading it. I haven't read any of your books, though, was the clarifier. And I was just like, what? And it was a male author had overheard this interaction and quickly sort of like shuffled in and chased him away. So that's kind of maybe one of 5 to 6 interactions I've had in person and face to face with men. All the interactions have been with men who've thought that way, which compared to the, hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands at this stage, emails that I've had and tweets that I've had that have said horrendous things like that. So yeah, I mean, like say 6,000 emails or something compared to 6 dudes real life. It's very rare that they ever come and say it to your face. But the fact that somebody still feels like they can send you those emails and say those things is pretty messed up. Pretty messed up.
It is. And, as an anti-violence against women organization, we get emails from men.
I bet.
Either telling us or telling us that the survivor whose story you've featured is a liar.
Mm.
Uh-huh. Yep. So,
yep.
Yeah. We, and our policy is basically, if you're going to hurl abuse at us and at everyone else who's busy, reading the articles about violence against women, or sharing a helpline, or sharing a chat line in different countries, you are going to get banned and you're going to get reported. Because basically they're showing themselves for who they are.
Exactly. And I think it's great that you guys have the kind of, like, it's no bullshit, you know what I mean? You have this kind of organization and structure and attitude where you're just like, we don't have to tolerate this. Let's block, report, and move on. And it's so funny, like on social media, I used to have a much more sort of open door policy of like, sometimes I would get these messages and I would think that I could respond to that person or like start a dialogue and argue back or vice versa. And it's just like, no, nobody is entitled to your mental space. And that can be for in your real life, if somebody is harassing you verbally or physically it's a different situation, but verbally, if somebody is in your space and really making you feel uncomfortable and unsafe, nobody is entitled to your space. And that's the same for online as well. I think that if somebody is got a terrible attitude, even, it doesn't have to be something as overt as a horrible threat or somebody tweeting something that they're going to physically do to you. You don't owe anybody access to your space. And so I've changed my social media policy a lot in the past few years as this kind of stuff has gotten worse, unfortunately, because I think they're losing. And so it eventually is starting to get worse because they can sense the end is nigh. So I just block, report, and move on. No interaction, no discussion. If I'm not liking what you're bringing to the table, it's a block, it's a mute, it's a report. And yeah, I haven't got time for it. Keep it moving.
Yeah, and Chuck Wendick likens them to dinosaurs waving, dinosaurs while the meteor is headed towards them.
Yes, so, I think that's accurate. I think that's that's definitely on the money.
So we've come to our final question. It's a Captain Obvious question, but we asked this of all the authors that we've had, all 130 plus of you who we've had on Read for Pixels over the last 7 years. You have had you have been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. So why do you support the cause to end violence against women, and what do you think authors can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
The reason I support the cause to end violence against women and girls is it's something that affects all of us. It's something that has affected me personally. It's something that has affected my family members, my friends. It's something that impacts strangers, women that I've never met before, who I hope have an opportunity to have a better life and a better world without the threat of physical violence or emotional violence, both of them which can be incredibly harmful. It's one of the most important causes, I think, that I can get behind, that anybody can get behind, regardless of if you're a man, woman, or gender non-identifying, non-binary, anything. And I think what we can do as authors is hopefully signal boost, put a spotlight on this, raise more understanding about the topic and the issue and how complex it can be, how terrifying it can be. And for me personally, I'm always trying to write characters that women who maybe don't feel as strong in their everyday life, that they can identify with and recognize, and hopefully get a little bit of a morsel of strength from them, even if it's a fictional character, that they can use that in their real world, in their real life as well.
Yeah. So I'll put myself on screen now because
oh my God,
this is me, the disembodied voice off stage. Thank you for being with us today, Maria. And Maria has also generously donated some really, really cool treats for donors. And we have them up at our Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. And there's one 30-minute Skype call. So Maria's happy to chat about anything. So if you're enjoying this session with us today, and you want to chat more with Maria about specific things like writing, publishing, movies, geek culture, she's ready to chat. Just make a donation. You can go to our fundraising page and scroll down and click on, Maria, the little listing with Maria on it, at say Skype call, and make the donation requested, and we'll get right on that. And there are also two different opportunities to be immortalized by Maria. So the first one is naming a minor character in Maria's third Who's Afraid book, called Who's Still Afraid, and that's coming out in summer 2020. So if you want that, again, go to our fundraising page. I'll share the screen. I'll share the link right now. Let's see.
Also, the Tuckerizations, if there's anything specific you want, just let me know. I'm happy to chat through it with you. We can make you any kind of supernatural creature you like. We can make you a banshee or a goblin. You just let me know, whatever your jam is.
Yeah. And the other one is to name a minor character in Maria's book that is coming out at the end of 2020. There's no title yet for it. And for this particular Tuckerization, in addition to what Maria already said, you can choose whether the character is a goodie or a baddie. So you want to be a good guy or bad guy. I don't know. Some authors go. You can also choose to die a horrible death on page. I can make that happen.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to die a horrible death, just let me know, because there's always a few of them per book. I always wanted to play somebody, I'm a big horror movie fan, but I always wanted to play a cadaver in a horror movie, like on the slab kind of thing. And I got to play a zombie in Little Monsters and eat Lupita, or attempt to eat Lupita Nyong'o in the last sort of few months. And so I was like, oh my God, it's my dream. I always wanted to play a dead person in a horror movie, and now I get to play a living dead person. So that's pretty good trade.
Yeah, and the great thing is Maria's goodies are available to donors anywhere in the world. So you better hurry up to donate to get them, because there are only a limited number of these. And once someone makes a donation, snaps them up, that's it, they're gone. The good news is that we've raised $5,440 so far, which means that we've shot past our initial $5,000 goal. And we now need to reach $10,000 as our stretch goal, because last year was a really tough year for fundraising, and we do need to keep our programs like this one, like Read for Pixels, running. So please give generously. All funds go towards supporting our work. And if you are not up for being tuckerized in front of the great wide world, there are also plenty more author goodies available from authors including Tamora Pierce, Anna Stevens, Kandara Blake, Leanna Renee Hyber, Maya Rodell, Kat Howard, PC Cast, and more. And new goodies are released every Friday throughout March. So if you can look at the screen here, we have the link to get to the donation page, which is bit.ly/R4P Rally Up IWD 2020. And it is case sensitive, so you have to type in exactly. And if you want to find out more about Read for Pixels, which is the program that we're running right now with authors, cool authors like Maria, go to bit.ly/Read for Pixels. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And if any of you want to learn more about violence against women and what you can do about it, you can visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. And Maria, do you have any announcements you want to make? Anything coming up?
Who's Still Afraid is coming out in the middle of this year. That date might get pushed back a little bit just because of obviously issues with printing at the moment and the situation happening in the world. But there's another book coming towards the end of the year. But honestly, if you just follow me on social media, I can update you when that stuff happens. And I just want to say thank you so much to the Pixel Project for letting me be a part of this campaign. It's something that's so important to me, and so I'm really chuffed to be able to help out however I can, even if it's just little bit.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on air with us today. And thank you, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Hope you have a great weekend. We have Kat Howard coming tomorrow at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Kat will be continuing the conversation that we've been having throughout March about women and girls in books, violence against women in pop culture, and so on and so forth. So I guess Maria and I will bid you all good day, good night, wherever you are in the world. Stay safe, okay?